This is TWiT.
Back in 2005, Apple began to support podcasts by including them in iTunes, and that meant iPod users had direct access to all that free content. Apple then made it relatively easy for new iPhone users to find, subscribe, and enjoy podcasts on their smartphones. Google, on the other hand, has had a rough go at podcast support on Android. In 2009, you may remember they released Google Listen. It was a product out of its Google Labs experimental division that was later opened up for a wide release to the growing Android user base. The app was a search engine and subscription manager for podcasts, but it was poorly designed. Almost exactly 3 years later, Google shuttered Listen since the Play Store was filled with plenty of third-party podcast aggregators. And funny side note, anyone managing playlists inside Listen, when it was shuttered, they were consoled with the fact that those playlists would move over to Google Reader. So, totally safe. Anyways, third-party developers seized on the opportunity presented here. Pocket Cast, Beyond Pod, Podcast Addict, and many more options have kept users very happy. Google tried again by adding podcast support into their Google Play Music app, but even that's going away sometime soon because, as you already know, YouTube Music becomes Google's next big music service. Are we confused yet? Now, Google is testing the old adage, third time's a charm, by releasing Google Podcasts earlier this week. Let's take a look at Google's latest effort to finally nail this 13-year fad. The Google Podcasts app isn't really an app in the traditional sense. It's more of a shortcut that launches the podcast functionality that is already on your device. It's actually hidden inside the Google Search app if you are up to date. But you wouldn't know it once you launch it. Things look pretty similar in design to Google's modern assistant stylings. A whole lot of white space with pockets of actionable information. Okay. Up top is a gallery of thumbnails for the podcasts that I have subscribed to within the app. I can tap on any one of those. It's going to take me through to the list of episodes for that particular podcast. I did notice that in some cases, episodes from different shows within a network all appeared in the same single list. Now, this isn't the case with TWiT shows, but Bigger Pockets, for example, has 3 different shows that they produce every week on their network, and they all ended up in a single episode list here, even though I only intended to subscribe to the main podcast. That is a little odd, and I don't know who's to blame for it, but hidden in the overflow menu here is actually a neat option to send this podcast to my home screen, and that creates a shortcut, which is a nice little extra. I can just tap it on the home screen and launch right into the podcast. Now, all of these episodes can be streamed by tapping play next to the episode on the list, or I can tap into the episode information and then choose to download it for later listening. While it's playing, I have access to the standard controls, complete with 30-second skip forward and 10-second skip backward buttons. There's also a playback speed option that personally I enjoy setting at 1.2 times the speed. Back on the main screen is a For You section, and this is where you find a list of new episodes from those subscribed podcasts, along with any downloads that you happen to store on your phone. And there's also an In Progress tab, which is really nice. This tracks where I am in my many episodes, and this tracking actually follows through Assistant, which means I can pause this podcast on my phone and then ask my Google Home to play that podcast, and it's going to pick up where I left off on my other device. Very nice. And this is a cool thing for creators. You can actually embed a donate button into the podcast show page to make a little extra money off of your show. Now, down below, you're also going to find all sorts of sections pulled from the many signals that you've given Google as to the many podcast interests you might have. Basically, a number of topical carousels to browse for new shows to listen to. And really, at this early stage, that's about it. Pretty bare bones. Though there is one final point, and perhaps this is the biggest promise of Google Podcasts. Up top is that ever familiar search button, which you will use to search for your favorite podcast by name. But this really ties into why this app is built into the Google Search app on the phone to begin with. Google plans to add new features in the coming months that will further integrate its AI smarts and search capabilities into podcast content. This is super exciting. It's going to include things like auto-generated closed captioning of podcasts, on-the-fly translation so you can understand podcasts that were recorded in other languages, and search capabilities that reach into the podcast content. Meaning you could do a Google search for, two-factor authentication with Google Voice and magically be pointed to that time on This Week in Google when I locked myself out of my Google account in the middle of the show. The possibilities are pretty cool if you ask me. Overall, Google Podcasts is a good starting point, maybe a little bland and feature-less, but it's what it promises to deliver in the near future that has me intrigued. I'm Jason Howell, and you can catch me on All About Android, Tech News Weekly, and pretty much everywhere else on the TWiT network.